There it is, top of the hour. We get started on time with these, so we're gonna kick the thing right off. We are expecting a few other folks that have signed up, and we're glad to have it. But Mike, you are here. Thank you for joining us on this. This is the second Interop workshop that we have put together, and we're going to continue this series. And we're trying to provide good information in a very interactive type of forum where we can get not only have people get really good information from this, but also share as well. So I appreciate you being here. I will ask if you can turn on your chat there a little bit, because we are going to be sharing some things in the chat, and you can certainly throw any questions or anything else that you've got there. This is also this is very open mic, and no pun intended on names there. It is open mic for us to do. If you need to break in and say, Ron, you're full of it, that's by all means, step right up. That's what it's for about. It's all about. This is a technical discussion overall, which usually makes me shut up. But before I get to that part, a little bit of homework here. Predominantly, what we're going to talk about is healthcare data exchange, and that comes in the form of integration engine, usually Mirth Connect, because that's what we happen to use around here. Tips, tricks, and traps with regard to that, and predominantly the national networks, Carequality, eHealth Exchange, and CommonWell, as well as the up and coming QHENs via TEFCA as well. But that doesn't mean there isn't other subjects. We're hoping that people will bring them, so don't hesitate, like I said. I'm Jim Benson. I am the host of this. I'm also the CEO of Zen Healthcare IT, and the guy in the hot seat that is answering most all of these things, as I think everybody knows, is Ron Wilson. He's the VP of engineering services here for Zen, and the architect of an awful lot of the stuff that we do on a day-to-day basis. So without further ado here, we'll jump into it. The first thing on the agenda is actually a little bit of a follow-up from the Interop workshop that we covered last week. And we predominantly were talking about just what are the national networks and how they operate when we talked last week. And if by chance you didn't get a chance to see that one, just put a chat or an email, throw that into the chat, and we'll make sure that you get a link to that one if you're interested in being able to see that. So that is recorded, and we can do that as well. And there was also interesting follow-up that we had from last week with regard to messaging conformance and SAML. So Ron, you had mentioned that to me. Grab a hold of that for a second and kind of give us the 411 on what you found out.
Yeah, last week we were covering kind of how the underlying specifications are related to the national networks, and how the national networks kind of leverage those. And it's this particular issue is it's a large EMR vendor that's we're working to do some XDS implementation, and they are building I would say a more current SAML assertion out of their code base than what is currently used in the national networks or the conformance for NHIN specification relative to XDS data exchange. And it's an interesting problem because it seems simple, but it's not. There's a reference in the SAML assertion for subject name ID or subject ID and issuer referencing. So you're referencing an SSL certificate, or you're referencing a person, and there's multiple versions of methodologies in that format to encrypt and decrypt that value, or how you use that reference. And in the NHIN specification, it's explicitly referenced as SAML 1.1 spec. So the SAML 1.1 has a very technically, formatted way of managing, leveraging that certificate and encrypting and decrypting and how you do it. And this particular vendor is transmitting messages that is using SAML 2.0 as the standard. So for the format, and that's not a simple change in a national network perspective, right? The gateway needs to do things a very explicit way. You might be able to have it do multiple things potentially, but it's not simple, right? It's not necessarily something that you can just push a button and do. I reviewed it with the team, and it's not going to be an easy thing to accommodate that vendor. So this is what the national networks have done is they've given us this, documented, very explicit way to do things and a real good roadmap on how to implement it. And when we see something outside the national network in the wild, we're seeing that they're using a more generic reference of the spec or the available options. And so now you've got, an entity who speaks French is now trying to talk to somebody speaking German, and it's not going to work well, right? So this is the real key to the national networks and their constraints or conformance statements to say, if you're on the network, you will do X. And it makes it really, it's interesting because it makes it very hard to implement this technical framework. Again, technical framework, national network conformance statement, and above that would be the technology SAML, right? In SAML, there's multiple layers and features. If everyone keeps moving to the latest and greatest feature, nobody would be able to talk to each other. Right?
So what are they promulgating and what how much of this have they run into before, and what's their roadmap going forward in specifying things like versions of SAML?
It's interesting, because of the movement in the national networks to FHIR, most of the attention to updates has been pushing towards focusing on the FHIR aspect of the data exchange. There was some movement and we're going to get into this today with specific transactions. There has been some movement in some of the SAML assertions more recently, but they're not at a security level. They're more at a functional or form level. There's been some newly added elements and then some guidance on changes to content in existing elements that better represent who is querying and how they fit into the network, as an example. And then there has been some movement in expanding some security items, but it's metadata, not methods or encryption related to ACP, Advanced Consent Policy. So we're still, kind of in that window of the mid-2000s core technology and trying to stick to that so that folks aren't having to, update their gateways on the regular,
So the networks support 1.1 and this client went to 2, and is that how you discovered, oh right, you're sending me, right, okay.
Yeah, and so we're trying to do an integration with them. A point-to-point integration is what we would call that, right? It's just between us and them. It's not on the network. The entity is not on the network, and most likely this is the reason why they're not in the national networks, because they're not building a nationally network conformant payload. And the options are on our side is to not validate SAML, which would be a no-no relative to security, right? But that's what happens generally in the wild, is when folks can't get to commonplace on this, they just, okay, it's too difficult, just turn it off. And if it's on a VPN, you could probably get away with that technically because it's specifically coming from, their source system and those types of things. But without SAML, you can get what's called a retry attack.
Sure.
And, anyone that can capture that message or get their hands on it from somewhere, could be in a database, could be for President John Smith, the CEO of some large company, and somebody's firing away back on that patient data without issue. Where with SAML, the message would be expired by the time somebody most likely got their hands on it, and it would fail because of that.
You're bringing up something that I think is important for us to mention here overall. It's a technical discussion, and you know, my experience over many years now is that when you present something like that, engineers put their thinking cap on real fast and go, "How can we get around this? How can we?" Okay, that's not an area that you should go, "Oh, well, let's just turn it off on." That really is an area that requires some good forethought and some planning and some real discussion with the people at the networks that are in charge, that they need to make some recommendations on how to do this. The backyard mechanic can get themselves in a lot of trouble by just going, we won't validate the SAML, and look, it works.
Yeah.
But this is an older standard. I bet in the fire world, there's less reason to circumvent it. It's in this little bit older world.
Right? Yeah. And that was one of the things, Mike, in the last meeting that we were talking about, was just the age, right? But the age of it is also, I think, a feature, right? Because, you know, the technology's proven. There's lots of support in it, you know, in the development platforms. And in this particular issue, the networks are using the NHIN specification framework is using SAML 2.0, but it's just for a few items that they went back when they wrote the spec and said, we're going to use 1.1 encryption here for this type of encrypted element. And so it's a mix and match is what it is. And I think at the time, and again, we've got to keep in mind, most of this originated in the mid-2000s, both the NHIN specification and the formal SAML specifications. So you got to think about hardware back in that day. So could the hardware effectively transact a SHA-256 transaction at scale to do an encryption and a decryption versus a SHA-1 or another algorithm, right? And the encryption method would matter relative to performance. So that's most likely why that was implemented in that way.
Yeah.
I'm old enough to remember the 2000s. You know, I used to, when I was straight out of uni, I was flying around to data centers and none of this cloud malarkey.
Right. No, very different. Yeah. Unfortunately, I am as well. I remember that and a bit more. All right, we'll move on here on this one and to today's topics, and they center around the IHE transaction types and the use cases thereof. So we're going to start with the IHE transaction types. Now, you know, this is a technical discussion. Again, I would say that multiple times. You know, ours is not the purpose here to, you know, read the documentation and other things that you can look at yourself. I just shared the link that we've got here to, you know, some specification documents that can give that kind of information to, you don't need us to read those kind of things. But to start out with the transaction types in the ITI type transactions, Ron, I want to give it a little bit of a scope here in terms of we're going to be talking about again, eHealth Exchange and Carequality. They're different animals. You know, Carequality is much more. It's a framework, not an actual processing. eHealth is different, like we talked about last week. But my understanding here is that those two entities promulgate and support different sets of the types of transaction. Address that a little bit more, if you will.
Yeah, in the underlying IHE specifications, there's 150, 130 transaction types that are available or have been defined for various XDS, XCA, XDR, data exchange. And there are use cases, again, speaking to what the distinctions between the networks, right? Remember, we were kind of talking about what's different between eHex and Carequality or CommonWell.
Exactly.
eHex was primarily hospital systems and HIEs. So when you think about a hospital system, you know, the needs of a hospital system are different than a podiatrist completely, right? You have infectious disease issues that are going to be more prominent there. And with the recent, you know, COVID pandemic, there was a quick response to that to help entities on the networks do things like syndromic surveillance submissions or pushes of documents. And the core transactions between the two networks, the three networks, let's say, including CommonWell, I always kind of leave them on the sides because they're kind of behind the Carequality network. So, but they are their own network, and that's important to reference that. Would be an ITI 55, a patient discovery, and in the technical nomenclature, we reference that as an XCPD, cross community patient discovery, is what that stands for. An ITI 38, cross community document query, or an ad hoc document query. And then a ITI 39, a cross community document retrieve, where you actually go pull the document back from an endpoint. And then there were two new transactions that were added formally to the EHEX supported transaction types. An ITI 41, which is a XDS, which is the cross domain. I think an XDS is domain, called something like that. Provide register document set. And so that's a document push, where you could push a document to an endpoint in an unsolicited form. So initiator activates the submission, and the responder or the receiver doesn't know it's coming. In the XCPD, DQ, DR, patient discovery, document query, document retrieve, those are all initiator based. And you have to go through that chain to actually get a document back. So it's a little bit different concept. And then the last one that's important, I think, for most folks is ITI 80, which is a cross-community document provide. And both the 41 and the 80 are used to submit public health documents to APHL, other state agencies, and other national organizations for syndromic surveillance. So those are the cores. The final one that's becoming more active is what's called mobile health data exchange. And it's a set of specific messages used for the cellular phone, EMS units is where that's used heavily, is in EMS units, because they're on mobile radio equipment, not necessarily on computers. And that's getting better, but it's still a component of the EMS around the country. So that's called MHD. I'm not real familiar with that, but it does exist, and it is live and working on eHealth Exchange.
And for those of you that are watching, when he says that, there's an area to see if you can stump the chunk on. So,
there you go.
So you know. Now, my understanding, and correct me, is XDS.B, which is the set B, used to be used all the time. Is it still used as widely as it is? Is that use case still as vibrant as it was, or is the marketplace migrating more to the ITI 55, 38, and 39?
What's interesting here about this is it's like most things that are fostered by the government, right? All of this launched from NHIN and the government promoting it, right? The government invested money early 2000s to try to start communicating data. XDS was the original formulated transportation model. And then XCA was derived off of that, with some minor modifications for particular purposes or problem statements that existed. What we see today in the wild is on the national networks, it's strictly XCA. Point-to-points is where you'll see more XDS. And it comes from, my understanding, it comes from EMR technology and the way it's constructed and the way it started, and how it's easier for them to leverage with point-to-points XDS in many cases than it is with XCA. Some of the larger EMR vendors now, they're synonymous to each other. They don't really distinguish them. But when you get into the messaging very distinctly, there are small deviations between the XDS flavor of the transaction versus the XCA flavor of the transaction. In the XDS world, there isn't really a concept of a patient discovery. It was traditionally done as a push, provide and register. So you're basically pushing a patient demographic data into a partner to say, hey, this is our reference to Ron Wilson. Create a correlation in your world and manage that. And that was one thing that XCA wanted to solve, is because correlations become problematic over time because patients get merged, patients' names changes, all kinds of things happen. So that's the concept of a patient discovery in the XCA world kind of came around to say, I'm just going to give you my demographics. You don't really need to know my patient ID, because you just tell me your patient ID and I'll go make the transactions from there.
Yeah. So, we're going to be talking about use cases more, but this is a different kind of use case. The transactions with the national network are kind of a different purpose of use than the EMR to the EMR, the point-to-point kind of connection. Yeah,
exactly.
Got it.
And
when you say point-to-point, you mean literally that's without going through eHex as an example?
Correct.
Right. Okay.
Exactly, Mike. If you had, this happens a lot in various regional health systems, right? You might be a partner in the Memphis area, and you don't need or want to connect to the national networks, but you need to talk to Baptist Health System, which is a large health system in Tennessee, northern Mississippi here. And you could do a point-to-point connection and use the same core technology and the same core workflow, and it would look, feel, and behave just like national network transactions. It's just a connection directly between you and that health system.
So the corresponding IT departments in each entity has their own MERF version, and they just configure it like an integration.
In many cases, these big hospital systems, they're just leveraging the same core technology that they already have on the national networks. They're just doing it through a different connection definition, which would be a mutual TLS typically, or a VPN. And they're doing the same thing. They're using an OID, they're configuring endpoints, and that gets transported or routed over a certain connection methodology. And then the transactions just happen organically. So it's really pretty straightforward relative to how the national networks work, which is really kind of slick. And relative to Carequality, there's a cool feature that Carequality supports. And remember that when we're on the point-to-point, I'm going to go through some other items here on Carequality, and we'll come back to this really trick feature on point-to-points.
Yeah. So I'm going to share the specification document that we've got there for eHex. It's pretty much the stuff that we just talked about here. And a quick comment on that. You mentioned the XDS.B being much more of a point-to-point. VPNs, and our experience is, you correct me if I'm wrong here, is that people have recognized that the vast number of VPNs that end up having to be in that hub and spoke kind of setup is just getting to the point where they can't do it anymore. We're even seeing many the EHRs and others saying, if you need a VPN, you're not going to get connected because we're not going to support it. Am I right?
Yeah, that's really the trend right now. Is people are even talking about straight HL7 integrations going to mutual TLS nowadays, and just dropping the whole VPN construct altogether. Which is really promising for the industry, in my opinion. Right. And again, it's like all things, right? You get into an organization and their security person says, no, we're not doing anything but VPNs. The rest of that stuff's not secure. And then you'll get into organizations, and lots of Epic shops right now are doing no VPNs. We'll do mutual TLS, and that's the only way we're going to do it moving forward. So
well,
it's an interesting paradigm.
I can tell you from a selfish standpoint that I won't be disappointed when VPNs are
thing of the past, right?
Rare or a thing of the past, because it is just expensive to work and maintain it. and deal with them all the time.
Or like with zero trust, they need to get smarter. That's, really, get smarter about it, right? Let me go log into a zero trust solution and make the tunnel for me,
Exactly.
Um,
Okay, so we talked to eHex and what they support. Let's talk about Carequality and what the differences are and why.
Great. Carequality supports the top three: XCPD, DQ, and DR again, all XCAs. And
Familiar with those, as you know. Very familiar with those three.
Yes.
Right.
And they're identical in their implementation in the Carequality world, other than a couple of small things that I was talking about relative to changes for advanced consent policy and a couple new things coming out of eHex that ultimately Carequality is probably going to adopt. But pretty much same, no major differences. And then Carequality also supports a new transaction that started beta, I don't know, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, Brian. It was what, 2019, 2020, right before COVID. XCA-I, this is DICOM imaging data exchange support. Interesting project. Lots of moving parts there, but it's two new transactions, RAD 69 or RAD 79. And then there is a DICOM XOS payload response that's required, which is a content element that's a little bit different in some workflow steps from a perspective of traditional XCA exchange. And Zen supports this XCA-I to a certain level at this point, the Zen Stargate product. It was a fun project that we worked on that.
These are massive files, aren't they? These are the massive image files.
Yes. Big payloads or streamed. It's an interesting problem statement because it's, you can chunk the data, you can stream the data, you can batch download the data, you can hand off a link to the data. And this is an area where they opened the specification pretty far for interpretation and usability. And that is probably, that's complicating the adoption of it, frankly, right? Because there are 4 ways to exchange that DICOM imaging, and folks have to integrate that somehow into their stack. And if imaging system A does it one way and imaging system B does it another and imaging system C does it another, you got 3 ways of having to build it to consume it and so on. So and for all kinds of various reasons, it's really an interesting problem.
As a matter of fact, we should probably put on for a future episode where we ask the Carequality folks to come and address that a little bit, because that would be really good. Our experiences was really good with it, and we made it fairly effective. But it is, like you're saying, they're huge, and it causes lots of concerns about how do you do that going forward. Obviously, we need it, but the development of how it actually gets implemented is a big deal.
And what's the average file size of a DICOM image?
Well, the project, it was in proof of concept beta, so we actually never went live with it or haven't gone live yet. I know there is some live exchange going on between 2 players. Philips and Ombra is one of the players that's in the arena, and they're doing links with like an SSO pattern to view it or use the viewer to download it, which was interesting.
Is that through Carequality, Ron, or is that
through Carequality? They were already doing those technology
rather than send over the wire.
And those technology vendors already kind of have their own world of connectivity. It's its own siloed little scenario where these imaging vendors have been working with each other, interconnecting. And the concept of the Carequality world was to start to work to expand this into the networks and make it more readily available, make it easier to connect. And I don't believe the pilot has really gone live to the network in general yet. So there's still a lot of work going on in the space to try to dial it in. But it's it's very promising, and it's something folks need. I mean, Jim, you've had I had my hip replaced. You go get an MRI and you got to wait for them to burn the DVD to take it back to the doc to look at, because that's the only way it works. You know what I mean?
It's literally go to the imaging center and pick up the DVD and deliver it.
To hand
Has
deliver it to you.
technology not made it more smart, more efficient and smaller?
It's crazy, but it's there. So, but the diagnostic quality image is a monster. It's a real issue.
It is. And then I was talking about that next trick thing in the Carequality network. So any of those hundreds of transactions that we talked about earlier that were in the master list, if you're a Carequality implementer, Carequality enables you, according to the agreement, to leverage the Carequality security context in a point-to-point connection. So it really streamlines any point-to-point connections that you make if you're a Carequality participant with other Carequality participants, and you need to do things outside of the workflow defined or use cases defined in Carequality. So if you were both Carequality implementers, you can use your Carequality security context, which makes it really easy from a connections perspective, because you have to have your Carequality certificate to participate in Carequality. And if that connects the dots to your point-to-point connections, then it's all the same. Makes it real easy to manage your security context.
So that is available because Carequality is a framework, not necessarily a technology, but because everybody's playing by the same rules there. If you are one and I'm one, we can connect directly, exchange the security, and we're connected.
And then you could go implement any of those other transactions that might fit your use case. You could do notifications, you could do referrals, you could do anything else that maybe is not necessarily live or openly supported, generally supported in the national networks right now. There are transactions I've left off here. This is the X360 space, because it's just not getting the traction that they had hoped. But that does exist also, and it's kind of in a beta or testing mode. And this is an electronic referral workflow to refer and get back details. So it is a push-pull kind of a scenario. And then so if you wanted to do a point-to-point and there was a particular transaction you wanted to implement, if you are on CQ, you can use the CQ security context and do that with your gateway, which again helps manage. Security or certificate management is a big problem in the marketplace.
Sure.
The security folks are wanting to shorten up the expiration timeframes on them, right? I mean, there were folks making them not expire ever and using those, and then folks went to 2 years, and now they're going to 1 year. And last I heard, the industry's wanting to push them to 90 days.
Yeah.
So the less certificates that you have, the better, right? From an implementation perspective, and things to touch. And then CommonWell supports everything that CEQ supports through the Carequality network. I have not evaluated a direct connection via CommonWell because it's just not on our radar at the moment. And so I would be a chump if I tried to get too deep into that and not know enough about it. But maybe someday we'll connect directly to CommonWell and I'll learn more about the benefits and features that they have direct versus Carequality. But right now,
and I just had a question about that, and you preempted it.
I gotta keep you straight.
So,
go ahead.
I was just going to ask you the point-to-point using the two Carequality implementers. Is that widely known, or is that a capability that is brand new, or
No, it's not widely known and it's not brand new. It's in the participant agreement, and it was actually brought to our attention via a point-to-point integration with Epic and the Epic team. Who we're getting closer and closer to because of the number of integrations that we're doing and the activities that we have. they presented it to me, and I took it back to Merrill Lee, and I said, we need to look at the agreement and see where that's at. And I just need to make sure. She said, yeah, sure enough, it's there. So, it's, and there's all kinds of things in that data sharing agreement or participant agreement on both networks. I had another one this week that we learned. There is a new requirement coming out of eHex to make changes to the message payload. We thought it was due tomorrow or Thursday, Friday this week. And I was kind of pulling the fire alarm a little bit, like how hard do I got to beat the team up to get this done? Reached out to eHex and he said, oh no, you got 120 days to implement. I'm like, well, where's that at? And he pulls out some verbiage out of the data sharing agreement, participant agreement that says, yeah, anytime there's a implemented change, you have 120 days to implement. So, one of those things.
Well, but it is a really good point. And while I'm really glad that everybody's got 120 days, for us and the way that we normally work, that's an eternity. But for most of the marketplace, that's like tomorrow. So
Yeah.
we need to be making sure that people are aware that those changes are imminent and supporting them, whether they're coming through us or through anybody else or themselves.
Yeah, and when we talk about things like that, it's really interesting. Anything that's not prescriptive in the networks is left to the implementers or the network participants to kind of duke out and resolve, right? So, like, there's a thing going on right now. There's a new implementer that is presenting a SAML assertion expiration that's 20 minutes long. And the de facto standard has been 5 minutes. Well, in most of these gateways, that's a hardened system level setting, right? And so it presented some heartburn for us. And they're doing it for a technical reason in their own stack, which would cause them a bunch of grief. Specifications don't stipulate. SAML doesn't say it can't be an hour or can't be 2 days or whatever.
Right.
But
so there are elements that that are according to Hoyle, but that the people at large, the entities at large that are doing it, have standardized on, and you need to conform to those.
It's it's the old battle of Microsoft versus Apple, right? De facto standards versus not. I mean, may not like it, but that's the reality. And that one, along with some others, resulted in some participant implementer discussions. Like, are you guys going to support the 20-minute expires? No, we're not. Okay.
Nor
I
are we.
don't like that. My CISSP is saying he doesn't like it. We got to come up with something, and so it ends up in the community chatter,
Sure.
in prompting the implementer to resolve it, and so on. So
yeah. Well, we got a new person that just joined us. We're going to have a whole lot more here in future ones. Jomo,
welcome.
Buddy.
How's it going, buddy?
I just came to hear the Ron drop some knowledge. That's why I'm here.
Good to see you, man.
Good to see you guys.
About 38 minutes of really great stuff so far, but we can send you a link to it. You can catch up.
That'd be awesome. And Brian, I love your head, dude. Looking good, buddy.
I was inspired by you, Jomo.
Hey, man.
Mike, Jomo's an old friend of ours, so we know him well.
Yep.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, buddy.
Glad to hear, my friend. We're just changing topics here. We've covered pretty much everything on that one. We did want to talk about the IHE because it's all about IHE right now. The different use cases, and just generally speaking, if you've been paying attention to any of the news there at all, while not necessarily a technical aspect, because we try to keep on the technical pieces, it's more of a business thing. But it affects the technical aspects as well, and that is, there's been a bit of a brouhaha between Particle Health and Epic they've argued back and forth in public forums here. So there's there's no secret with regard to that. And my understanding is that that is still going on, at least to some degree. It certainly affects the national networks there overall. And that if the summary of that, it kind of talks about use cases and how the data can be used, and who is who must share and under what circumstances. So we want to talk a little bit about that. Ron, do you have any other comments with regard to that high level use case and from your point of view before we get into the nitty gritty?
It's because the health tech vendors are growing so fast, right? We've got all of these new business uses for things in the marketplace. We've got all these companies jumping up with AI to help coordinate care, specialties, radiologies, oncologists, the gastro guys, very complex health issues there, and there are companies out there helping them find solutions. So it becomes it's not as clear as it was that Dr. Bob is making a query for patient data to review prior to some kind of a visit.
Right.
And telehealth is another one that's really twisting everybody's head, in knots here, because, you can't take vitals in a telehealth call. Vitals are required in the US CDI 2.1. How does that work? How do I get a blood pressure out of a patient through a Zoom call and get it into a CCDA? You can't, right?
Yeah.
So you got content questions, you've got actionable care questions, you've got all kinds of things that are happening, and it's the wild west right now in a lot of ways, and no one really has answers. And I think Epic in some way is trying to create some rules of the road, trying to determine who should and who shouldn't and how. Mechanically, that's become very laborious for folks on all sides, them, us, folks like us. But, the traditional use case was treatment. It's Dr. Bob on an EMR keyboard, pushing buttons, querying the HIE, querying the hospital for records. It's crystal clear that it was a practitioner that most likely had the patient in front of them, or they were going to see them in a day or two and provide care. Today, that is really a different ecosystem in a space.
And there is a lot of discussion going on in the national networks overall on the definitions with regard to that. Now, you just mentioned, the standards with regard to being able to use a CPT code if you don't have some of the requirements of the CPT code because you're doing it online. That's a whole nother non-technical aspect, but it is kind of technical to in a different sense of the word, to being able to do that. So it is the wild west in that regard. But there are a number of things from the code technical standpoint that we want to touch on here on these different use cases, whether it's treatment, and care coordination, whether it's case reporting, whether it's encounter alerts, what have you. You and I covered a little bit of a list that we had here in preparation for it. Do a high level how, from a technical standpoint, those differ and what the effect of that is.
So in the traditional treatment use case, it's assumed that you have consent from the patient, or the patient has got hands on keyboard, and you're going to be actually giving them some kind of a care, healthcare solution.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas one of the newer use cases over the past couple of years was the Social Security disability benefits determination. Now, this is specific for the Social Security Administration, but there are other entities that are using the same workflow or use case to acquire clinical documents. One is a VA use case, which mirrors or is the same as the Social Security one. And from a technical perspective, they added what's called advanced consent policy. And advanced consent policy changes the workflow in these transactions to present a consent document in the middle of the initial XCPD. So Social Security Administration queries hospital system A, do you have records for Bob Ron Wilson? Hospital system A says, Social Security Administration, give us the consent document. They give them back, they do a DQ right in the middle of that XCPD. They do a DQ back to the SSA. SSA gives them back a document reference. And at that point, Hospital A can implement, retrieve the document, evaluate the document, or respond with a patient found, not found situation. And then the Social Security Administration would finish their transaction set, do a DQ and a DR. So from a technical perspective, these use cases are kind of moving the requirements of the messaging, the workflow of transactions and how they work. That this use case is the first one where we've had to have concurrent transactions in the middle of a transaction, if that makes sense.
So it's literally, I'm in the middle of transacting business with one entity, the and we're going to stop, go to the VA or SSA, get whatever it is, get information, and then if that comes back positive, continue on the other transaction.
Yeah, and this is specifically with the SSA requesting. So the SSA would be requesting from Hospital A, and you would query back to the SSA. Now, that same workflow could start to be used and is intended to be used in TEFCA for other use cases that are now becoming more and more prominent or being discussed.
This rings a bell, Ron. I think you've mentioned this to me before. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, you know, in a patient request use case, right? This kind of scenario could come up, meaning you're a technology vendor, you're providing a patient application, and you know they may start to support the patient request use case with a consent document versus just randomly supporting it. So I think we're going to see this ACP get broader leveraged implementation across other types of use cases. The life insurance application is another one that's really interesting, and it is similar in the workflow as the SSA implementation. So there are many use cases that are out there in the NHIN specification. It's just what is broadly supported. I mentioned the patient request use case that is supported in the national networks, but the acceptance or implementation of it is so low right now that it's really not usable, not effective.
And that is an area that we all need to focus on going forward. And there are a lot of nuances to that one because there's real value in being able to exchange for these different use cases. But generally speaking, you're not going to get much.
No. And you know, is when you get older, that patient request use case is something, you know, someone could use a lot, you know. When I had, you know, everyone knows I had pretty much serious health issues a few years back and spent a whole year doctoring. And I ended up with a folder that I would carry around about that thick. I need a copy of that. Give me that. Give me that. Give me that. And just trucked it around with me because, you know, I couldn't get access to it. They were having issues getting access to it. And I needed to stay on my timeline for what I needed to get done. Right. And so it is a problem. And if there was a PHR that was usable in the patient health record, and if there was an actual support for it, I could have done it all electronically through that application. Right. And forwarded it on to them and, you know, the whole 9 yards. Right.
Yeah. Now we've got a link here to the SSA.gov from GitHub. It's appropriate for me to share that here right now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's how they're documenting the implementation of it, what they support. They kind of walk through all of the technical bits. There is some SSA conformance issues that they're trying to manage or maintain on content, and that GitHub lays that out from both an informational perspective. It's not necessarily just a technical code GitHub base. It's how they're managing, communicating what they're doing with this particular use case for folks that they want to participate with, so people can get to the doco and understand the mechanics of this change in workflow, right? So Carequality has some other use cases that are new that I didn't put TEFCA in here yet because it's so new, but TEFCA's got their own use cases, and we probably at some point will have a whole discussion on TEFCA separate from this. I think it's appropriate because there's a lot more purpose of uses. They have different meanings, and there are other use cases in TEFCA that today
So is that like IAS as an example?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. And then in Carequality, they now have some FHIR-based exchange that's actually being promoted, and push notifications. And push notifications is FHIR specific. They never did implement the IHE flavor of that. But again, in a point-to-point connection, you probably could using that security context, and you would use some of those other ITI transactions to push data out on an interesting patient between the two entities.
Fantastic.
So
well, we've covered a lot of territory there. Guys, one of the things that we jokingly do here internally and getting prepared, we've referenced it a couple of times here, is leave a little bit of time for Stump the Chump if we can. This is like Jomo, you weren't here when we started, but this is an open forum with mics available to folks. And we do want to have a little fun if it's not in the cards for this one. If you come to a future one, and I hope that you will, to bring some questions. We'll see if we can stump Ron a little bit. Again, it's a technical discussion, not just what the characteristics are. Jomo, see if you can stump him.
No, I'm gonna come. I'll come next time with a stump the jump question. Well, how about this? How about what do you feel about TEFCA? Give me your emotional response to TEFCA.
Oh,
Because I've heard several really smart people want the whole thing gone.
Right? Oh, that's interesting. I don't see any downsides to it. I mean, from a technical perspective, it's pretty painless for us. There were some updates. There's some things we're having to manage based upon these new use cases. But in general, at the moment, from a technical perspective, it's just another network to me, and we're managing it that way. We have a QHIN that we support on it. We've been doing data exchange for that QHIN. So, so far, I don't see any downsides to it. I know on the business side, which, man, I have a hard enough time keeping up with the technical bits. The business side is Marilee's, and she helps keep me square on that. But I know on the business side, there's a lot of consternation and movement and things there. And I think, Jomo, to your point, in both directions. There's a lot of folks that are thinking, oh, that's the best thing since sliced bread. And there's other people going, this is just going to ruin things. But
well, then I also know that there are commercial vendors out there that are considering becoming QHINs, or right. I mean, and I've actually I stole some free consulting from BK on this. This is, it's fascinating and horrifying watching this whole thing unfold, right? And I'm curious also what your opinion is in California with its own QHIO debacle.
Yeah. We had hoped to be able to help them more, heavily, but anything new like this from the very beginning, the first HIE that I worked with ever was Kansas, and Maine. I worked with those two at the very beginnings in 2010, 2008, 2009. And they were pain, man. It was pain. There was a lot of pain. And when we look at the HIEs today, some of them are just moving great, and others are still having struggles. And I think that's what's going to be important about the QHINs in the TEFCA arrangement is it's got to be a value proposition, right? There's got to be a value proposition. If there's not a value proposition, in whether that's technology or data or simplified use, they're not going to make it, right? I think that's the key element.
Yeah. Jomo, I'm going to, sorry, Ron, I didn't mean to cut you off there, but I wanted to ask you a question. I'm going to bet that the people that you've talked to that are that hating the idea are probably associated with HIEs because they see them as direct competitors. Am I right?
Some, yeah, I would say if not most. But there, on the other side too, I mean, there are a lot of commercial vendors out there who are building internal HIEs as a strategic component of their business model.
Yeah.
Right.
Zeus, right? There's several orgs like that are some version of this longitudinal patient record is part of whatever it is they support, right? And so, this is, we talked about years ago, like this is the last strategic asset that these orgs need is the data.
Yep.
And it's getting harder and harder for startups to get access to data. And so there's these new brokers of it. And where does the QHIN fit into all that? If I join one QHIN, I know I can only join one. Is that the right one? Are they going to have the relationships they need? Is that going to be the most cost-effective way for me to work? Do I want to be a QHIN myself and establish the? I mean, this is, these are incredibly important decisions that these companies are making. And I feel like, it's still very unclear as to what exactly is the right thing to even advise people to do. That's my struggle. Like, I don't know what to tell them to do. Right.
Well, it is the Wild West. They've opened Pandora's box. There are going to be winners.
Yeah.
There will be losers, no doubt about it. But there's also, in some respects, it's difficult to figure out how to get the data. The good part is there's an awful lot more options to be able to get to data if you've got the correct use cases. So,
and features.
And features.
That's the other thing. The tooling matters too, right? And that's another thing that's going to be more and more developing. I think you're going to see more and more tooling leveraging some of these things. The record locator services are going to be helpful, and then coalescing all that information, right? Oh, this data is available through TEFCA and the QHIN. This data is available through Carequality over at Athena. And how do you find all that out and then leverage it for a given patient?
Well, we do end on time. We got 3 minutes left here. I do want to reserve just a moment or two to thank both of you for showing up and listening to us. We will grow. We're 200% more than we had last week.
Exponential growth.
So it's exponential growth. It is great. Our intention here for next week is to get into more details with regard to how to lever the national networks to your advantage, because there are a number of characteristics that we have bashed our head into and figured out. When Jomo, you kind of alluded to it. When you have situations where you make a request and you didn't get any data, that isn't necessarily because there wasn't any data available. There are a lot of characteristics about that request, the timing and all kinds of other characteristics that can influence the value that you get out of it. And we've experienced quite a bit of those, and we want to give some tips, tricks, and traps with regard to that here in next week's episode. So as we've been talking a little bit more globally, we're going to get into a little bit more meat and potatoes on these in the future. I would like to ask both of you guys, hopefully you found it a little bit worthwhile, and
Definitely.
the technical aspects will be worthwhile going forward. Please share it with your friends on LinkedIn and others, and encourage them. The more we can, beat Ron up and see if we can stump him overall.
I'll sell it just like that.
Right? There you go.
I had to go fact check myself from a comment for last week, and I was spot on.
Okay.
I said something about the last update to SAML was in 2004, and it was about right.
Okay.
I was looking at it earlier today. I'm like, sweet.
I'm sure that's a fluke. That won't happen again next time.
No, I know. I got to start using more approximation rather than trying to pull stuff out of this old beat up gray head.
Yeah. Well, we have a very dry topic usually here that we're talking about, and one of the things that we try to do in making it interactive and the way that we're doing it is to make it a little bit more fun and make it valuable to you as well. The reason why we do it. We will stop on time. I thank you guys again for showing up. Bring your friends next time. It's good to see you, Jomo. Good to see you, Mike.
Good to see you, buddy.
Bring your friends next time, and let's have some fun with an otherwise dry subject. You guys take care.
guys.
Talk soon. Bye.
Cheers.
Appreciate you guys. Thanks, guys.